Armin had always been a man who carried too much on his shoulders. Life had never been simple for him, but he never allowed himself to stop. He was not only the CEO of a struggling company but also a single father raising a little girl who depended entirely on him. The world often admired CEOs as people with power, luxury, and control, but for Armin, the title was more of a heavy crown than a privilege. His company was on shaky ground, and his role as a father was always on his mind. Every day, he fought battles on two fronts, one in the boardroom and another at home, where his daughter looked at him with innocent eyes that carried questions he could not always answer. The company he had built years ago was once full of promise. When he first started it, he was young, ambitious, and hopeful. Back then, he believed that with enough hard work, success would naturally follow. But as the years passed, markets shifted, competition grew stronger, and unforeseen financial burdens pressed down on him like a storm cloud. What had once been a thriving organization was now surviving month to month, fighting to keep clients, fighting to pay bills, fighting to breathe. And in the middle of all this, Armin was also fighting his loneliness. His wife had left years earlier, and since then, he had raised his daughter on his own. She was only 7 now, full of joy and mischief, and she had become his reason to keep going even when he felt he could no longer continue. But the latest problem at the company was unlike anything else. A major technical issue had halted operations, and without fixing it, the company could lose its biggest client. That client alone contributed nearly half of the total revenue. If they left, everything could collapse like a house of cards. Armin had no choice but to seek outside help. He called in consultants, people who were known in the industry as problem solvers. They were experts, carrying polished resumes and high fees. Armin didn't mind the cost at first, because he thought saving the company was worth any price. The first consultant came in with confidence. He spoke in complicated language, filled with technical terms and strategies. For a few days, he worked with the team, studied the system, and wrote long reports. Armin hoped each day that this man would deliver a solution. But after a week, the consultant sat across from him with a shrug. "I'm sorry," he said, "but this is beyond repair. My recommendation is to shut down the system and start over." It was advice that meant millions in losses. Armin was stunned. He paid the man, thanked him, and sent him away, but his heart sank. Still, he refused to give up. He brought in another consultant. This one came with even more confidence, dressed sharper, carrying better credentials. Armin tried to believe again. But within a few days, this consultant also failed. And then came another. And another. In total, 12 different consultants walked into his office, studied the same problem, promised a solution, and left with the same defeat. Each failure cost money, time, and hope. Armin felt his dream slipping away. At night, when he returned home, his daughter would run to him with excitement. She didn't understand the weight he carried. She would ask him to play, to read stories, to listen to her school tales. He forced himself to smile, to pretend that everything was fine. But when she went to bed, he would sit alone, staring at his laptop, staring at numbers that made no sense, wondering how much longer he could last. His body grew tired. His eyes showed the strain of sleepless nights. The staff at the office could see his exhaustion, though he tried to hide it. He knew they were afraid too. If the company failed, many of them would lose their jobs. They looked to him for leadership, but inside, he felt like he was drowning. And the worst part was that he could not let his daughter see his weakness. He wanted her to believe her father was strong, that he could protect her from the storms of the world. One evening, when Armin was about to leave the office late, his daughter called him. She had been waiting for him at home with her homework. Her voice was small, a little sad, as she asked, "Papa, why are you always late now? Why do you look tired all the time?" Those words pierced his heart more than any financial loss. He had no answer for her. He mumbled something about work being busy, but when he hung up, tears filled his eyes. He realized that this battle was not only about saving a company. It was about saving his role as a father, about proving to himself that he could balance both worlds. Armin began to doubt everything. Was he truly capable of running a business? Was he failing as a parent too? He felt trapped in a corner with no escape. The pressure from shareholders grew louder, his bank account grew weaker, and the problem in the system remained like an unmovable mountain. It was the darkest phase of his journey. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he held onto a small flame of hope. He reminded himself of why he had started the company in the first place. It wasn't for fame or money, it was to create something meaningful, something that would stand tall. He also thought of his daughter. Every time he felt like surrendering, he pictured her smile, the way she held his hand, the way she believed in him. That belief gave him the courage to fight one more day, even if every day felt like a losing battle. The story of Armin's struggle was not about glamour or success. It was about resilience, about a man trying to juggle two worlds that constantly demanded more than he could give. He was not perfect. He was flawed, exhausted, and at times, broken. But he was still standing, still showing up at the office every morning, still tucking his daughter into bed at night, still carrying hope even when hope seemed impossible. The 12 consultants may have walked away, but Armin had not walked away from his responsibility. That was the weight he carried as a single dad CEO, a weight that few could understand, but one that made his journey all the more extraordinary. Armin's mornings no longer began with excitement or energy. Instead, they started with the sound of an alarm that pulled him out of a shallow sleep, leaving him more exhausted than the night before. He would stare at the ceiling for a few minutes, wondering how he would face another day. His daughter, Aisha, would sometimes tiptoe into his room, climbing onto his bed with her books in hand, asking if he could check her homework before breakfast. He wanted to give her his full attention, but his mind was always elsewhere, caught between unpaid bills, unanswered emails, and the haunting fear of collapse. He would smile at her, correct her spelling mistakes, and kiss her forehead, but inside, the weight of failure pressed harder. At the office, the atmosphere had grown tense. Employees whispered in corners, uncertain about their future. They had seen consultants come and go, each one leaving without solving the critical problem. They knew the company's biggest client was close to pulling out, and that knowledge filled the air with silent panic. Whenever Armin walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his staff following him, some with hope, others with worry, and a few with quiet resentment. They wanted answers. They wanted reassurance. But all he had were tired promises. Every board meeting felt like a trial. Shareholders leaned forward with sharp questions: what is the status? Why are we paying so much without results? How long before this client leaves? Do you even have a backup plan? Their voices carried impatience, sometimes even anger. Armin sat there, explaining what the consultants had tried, what the next steps might be, but his words felt hollow. Each time he left the meeting room, his chest grew tighter. He could no longer tell whether he was defending his company or defending himself. The consultants had drained not only money but also trust. Each one had arrived with charm and confidence, and each one had left with the same excuse: it's too complex. It can't be fixed this way. After the 12th consultant walked away, Armin felt a final crack in his spirit. He had believed that experts had answers, that money could buy solutions. But reality had shown him otherwise. He was left with an unsolved problem, an empty wallet, and a room full of frightened employees. Late nights became his routine. He would stay at the office long after everyone had left, staring at papers, diagrams, and reports that all said the same thing: failure. His desk was covered with coffee cups, sticky notes, and half-read files. Sometimes, he would close his eyes, hoping that inspiration would come like a spark. But when he opened them again, nothing had changed. The problem sat there like a locked door with no key. One night, as he rubbed his tired eyes, he noticed his daughter's drawing pinned to the side of his computer screen. She had drawn a picture of the two of them standing together, smiling, under a sky filled with stars. Above their heads, in her childish handwriting, she had written, "My papa is the strongest." He stared at the words for a long time. A lump formed in his throat. The truth was, he didn't feel strong at all. He felt weak, lost, and afraid. But to her, he was still a hero. That thought both comforted and pained him. The next morning, when Aisha asked him why he looked sad all the time, he froze. She had never asked him directly before. He tried to smile and say that work was just very busy, but she tilted her head and studied his face in silence. That silence was heavier than words. He realized that children could see through masks more easily than adults. She could see his struggle, even if he didn't speak about it. For the first time, Armin asked himself a difficult question: was he teaching his daughter that giving up was acceptable, or was he teaching her to fight even when the world seemed impossible? That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked around his small apartment, thinking about his life. He remembered the days when he had started his business with nothing but an idea and determination. He remembered working late into the night while his wife was still with him, and how they had dreamed of building something lasting. He remembered how, after she left, he had promised himself that he would not only build a successful company but also give his daughter a stable life. And now, everything seemed to be slipping away. The breaking point came during another heated board meeting. One of the shareholders slammed his hand on the table and said, "We can't waste more money. Maybe it's time to shut this down before we lose everything." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Armin. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The thought of shutting down the company was like admitting that all his years of sacrifice had been for nothing. It would mean that every sleepless night, every risk, and every dream had ended in failure. More than that, it would mean breaking the promise he had made to his daughter to keep fighting for their future. When the meeting ended, Armin walked slowly back to his office. His hands were shaking. He locked the door and sat in his chair, staring at the floor. For the first time in years, he felt close to giving up. His mind raced with what-ifs. What if he lost the company? What if he couldn't provide for his daughter? What if he had to tell her that her hero had failed? The thought made him cover his face with his hands, holding back tears. He was a CEO in the eyes of the world, but in that moment, he felt like nothing more than a broken man. And yet, even in that dark hour, something inside him refused to die. It wasn't pride, nor was it ambition. It was the quiet voice of responsibility, the knowledge that if he gave up now, he would be letting down not only himself but everyone who depended on him, especially Aisha. She was the reason he had endured so much already. He couldn't allow her to see a father who surrendered. So he stood up, wiped his face, and looked at the mess of papers on his desk again. He still didn't have a solution. The 12 consultants had failed, and he had no new plan. But he decided that night that he would not give up. If he had to stay in that office every night until something broke through, he would do it. If he had to search in places no one else thought to look, he would. He didn't know where the answer would come from, but he believed that somewhere, somehow, a door would open. That decision didn't solve the problem immediately, but it gave him something he had lost: determination. He walked out of the office that night with tired eyes but a firmer step. He returned home, kissed his daughter on the forehead, and whispered, "I'll figure it out. I promise." She was already asleep, but speaking the words aloud felt like an oath to himself. The next phase of his journey was about to begin. What Armin didn't know was that the solution would not come from another expensive consultant, nor from sleepless nights over endless reports. It would come from the most unexpected person in the building, someone he had never once thought of as part of the answer. But before that day arrived, he had to walk through the fire of doubt, fear, and exhaustion, holding on only to the belief that giving up was not an option. The office was quiet at night, almost too quiet. Most of the staff had already gone home, their chairs pushed under their desks, their computer screens black. The only sounds left in the building were the soft hum of machines, the occasional flicker of a light, and the footsteps of the janitor moving from room to room. Armin sat in his office, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his eyes heavy with fatigue. Papers were scattered across the desk, and a cold cup of coffee sat forgotten near his elbow. He had been staring at the same report for nearly an hour, but the words had stopped making sense. For days, he had been repeating the same cycle: review reports, reread notes, check numbers, and try to find something everyone else had missed. The consultants had all told him the same thing: the problem was unsolvable. And yet, a small part of him kept whispering that there had to be a way. Armin rubbed his forehead and leaned back in his chair, trying to breathe through the stress that felt like a hand tightening around his throat. That was when he heard the sound of a mop bucket being wheeled down the hallway. The steady squeak of its wheels echoed against the floor, followed by the rhythmic swish of the mop. It was the janitor, Imran, a quiet man in his late 50s who had been working at the company for years. He rarely spoke, but he was always there, cleaning the hallways, tidying the office spaces, greeting people with a gentle smile when they noticed him. Most of the staff never gave him much thought, but Armin had always respected his consistency. Imran paused outside the glass wall of Armin's office and peered inside. "Long night again, sir?" he asked softly, his voice carrying both kindness and curiosity. Armin forced a tired smile. "Every night seems long these days." Imran hesitated, then pushed his mop bucket to the side and stepped closer. "Still the same problem?" Armin laughed bitterly, running his hands through his hair. "Yes, the same problem that 12 consultants couldn't fix. I've spent weeks on it, and we're still stuck." For a moment, Imran just stood there, watching him. Then, as if something had been on his mind, he said, "If you don't mind, sir, what exactly is the issue?" Armin almost dismissed the question. How could he explain something so technical to a janitor who wasn't trained in this field? But something about Imran's calm face made him pause. Maybe it was the fact that he had no one else to talk to, or maybe it was because he was too tired to keep it bottled up. So he began to explain. He simplified it as much as he could, talking about the system that had frozen, the way data was stuck in a loop, the malfunction that consultants had called irreversible. Imran listened quietly, nodding slowly as if he understood. His hands rested on the mop handle, his eyes thoughtful. When Armin finished, there was silence for a moment. Then Imran tilted his head and said something unexpected. "Have you tried resetting it from the secondary control panel instead of the main one? I noticed once, when I was cleaning, that the system sometimes doesn't respond until the backup is switched first. It looked like the wires were a little loose." Armin blinked, confused. "What?" Imran shrugged. "I'm no expert, sir. But every night, I've seen how the machines behave. Sometimes when I plug the vacuum cleaner into one outlet, it doesn't work. But when I try the other one, it runs fine. Maybe your problem is something simple, not as complicated as those consultants made it sound." For a moment, Armin just stared at him. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or dismiss it. But then, out of desperation, he decided to check. He walked with Imran to the control room, where the machines hummed quietly. Following Imran's suggestion, he tried the reset process in the exact sequence the janitor had described. What happened next left him speechless. The frozen system suddenly unlocked. The loop broke. The screen that had shown only errors for weeks now lit up with normal operations. The entire process that 12 consultants had failed to fix was solved just like that in less than a minute. Armin froze, staring at the screen as if it were a miracle. "No, no, this can't be real," he whispered. But it was. The problem that had nearly destroyed his company had been solved not by a consultant, not by a highly paid expert, but by the janitor who had simply observed quietly over the years. Imran stood beside him with a small smile, almost embarrassed. "I just thought it was worth trying, sir. Sometimes problems are simpler than they look." Armin turned to him, overwhelmed. He didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or hug the man. He felt relief flooding through him like fresh air after being trapped underwater. Weeks of stress, fear, and hopelessness lifted off his shoulders in an instant. He let out a long breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Imran, you just saved the company." The janitor waved his hand modestly. "Oh, no sir. I only noticed something. You're the one carrying the real burden." But Armin knew better. At that moment, he realized how blind he had been. He had placed all his faith in titles, degrees, and expensive expertise, never once thinking that someone who swept floors and emptied trash bins could hold the answer. Yet here was Imran, a man who earned less in a month than one consultant charged in a single day, solving a problem that everyone else had failed to fix. That night, Armin didn't leave the office feeling broken. He left with a strange mixture of gratitude and humility. He went home and for the first time in weeks, he smiled at his daughter without forcing it. He told her a bedtime story, listened to her laughter, and when she fell asleep, he sat beside her quietly, thinking about what had just happened. The more he thought about it, the more the lesson grew inside him. Wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Solutions don't always come from people with fancy job titles. Sometimes, the answer hides in plain sight, waiting for someone humble enough to listen. He had nearly drowned in pride, believing only experts could save him, when all along, the janitor who passed unnoticed every night had the key. The next morning at the office, employees noticed a change in Armin's face. His shoulders were lighter, his steps quicker. When he announced that the issue was solved, the office erupted in relief and joy. But when they asked how it happened, and he told them it was Imran's observation that unlocked the solution, they were stunned. For a moment, the whole company looked at the janitor with newfound respect. Armin made sure everyone knew the truth: we owe him our gratitude. Without him, we would still be stuck. Imran lowered his eyes shyly, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. But inside, Armin knew, this man carried a quiet pride. For once, someone had seen his value not just as a janitor, but as a thinker, a problem solver, and a vital part of the team. That night, when Armin tucked Aisha into bed, she asked him if work was still making him sad. He smiled and shook his head. "Not today. Today, someone reminded me that answers can come from anyone, and that we should never stop listening." She didn't understand the full meaning, but she hugged him tightly. And in that hug, Armin realized something: the company wasn't the only thing saved that day. His spirit, his belief in people, and his hope for the future had been restored. The next few days at the company felt different, almost as if a heavy storm had passed and the air was finally clear. For weeks, fear and uncertainty had clouded the workplace. People had been walking around with hunched shoulders and worried faces, unsure of what tomorrow might bring. But now, after the impossible problem was solved, there was laughter again in the hallways, conversations carried more hope, and employees seemed to breathe more freely. The company had been given another chance. Armin noticed the change in himself first. He no longer carried the same darkness in his chest. His steps were lighter, his voice more steady, and for the first time in months, he could look at his staff without feeling shame. He remembered standing in front of them after the crisis was over and telling them the truth, that the solution hadn't come from an expensive consultant but from their own janitor, Imran. There had been stunned silence at first, then clapping, and even laughter of relief. But what mattered most was the respect in their eyes, not just for him, but for Imran too. That night, when Armin sat alone in his office, he thought about everything that had happened. He replayed the moment when Imran had spoken up, the simple suggestion that had changed everything. He realized how close he had been to ignoring him, to brushing off his words simply because he was a janitor. The thought made Armin uncomfortable. How many other times in his life had he overlooked people because of their position? How many voices had gone unheard because they didn't come from someone with a title or degree? He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "I've been leading the wrong way." For so long, Armin had believed that leadership was about having all the answers or bringing in the most expensive experts. But now, he saw how wrong he had been. True leadership was about listening, really listening to people, no matter who they were. It was about valuing ideas, not just resumes. It was about humility, about admitting that sometimes the smartest solution comes from the most unexpected place. The lesson humbled him deeply. He realized he had been carrying a hidden arrogance, not out of pride but out of desperation. He had trusted big names because it felt safer, as if their fame would guarantee results. But in doing so, he had overlooked the people around him who also had wisdom, people who saw things differently because they lived closer to the problems. Imran had no fancy office or big salary, but he had eyes that observed quietly and a mind that paid attention. That was enough to save the company when 12 others had failed. The next morning, Armin called a meeting not with shareholders this time, but with his employees. They gathered in the main hall, curious about what he wanted to say. Armin stood at the front, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He told them everything, from his fears to the nights he almost gave up, to the way Imran had stepped forward with a simple idea. "I learned something important," Armin told them. "This company isn't built on consultants or on me alone. It's built on all of you, every single person in this room. Titles don't matter here. What matters is the ideas you bring, the way you care about the work we do together. If a janitor can save the company, then that means every one of you has the power to do the same." There was a quiet stillness in the room, followed by nods, and then applause. Some employees even looked at Imran with wide smiles, clapping for him directly. Imran himself stood at the back, slightly embarrassed, but his eyes shone with pride. For once, he was no longer invisible. Armin knew this was a turning point. From that day, he began to change the culture of the company. He encouraged open discussions, where anyone regardless of their position could suggest ideas. He told managers to listen more and talk less. He walked through the building every day, not just to check on work, but to ask people how they were doing, what they noticed, what they thought could improve. Slowly, the company began to feel less like a rigid hierarchy and more like a family. This shift didn't just save the company, it transformed it. People started to care more, to feel that their voices mattered. Even the smallest suggestions were taken seriously, and sometimes, those small ideas led to big changes. Armin saw productivity rise, creativity flow, and a new sense of loyalty grow within the team. Employees no longer came just for their paycheck, they came because they felt part of something meaningful. At home, Armin also felt the change. His daughter, Aisha, noticed it first. She would look at him at dinner and say, "Papa, you smile more now." He laughed every time she said it, but deep down, he knew it was true. The burden that once made him come home with a heavy face had lifted. He still worked long hours, but his heart was lighter, and that gave him more room to be a father. He could listen to her stories with genuine attention, laugh at her little jokes, and tuck her in at night without his mind drifting back to unsolved problems. One evening, as he read her a story before bed, Aisha suddenly asked, "Papa, who helped you fix your work problem?" Armin paused, then smiled. "Someone very kind and very smart," he said. Someone most people didn't notice, but I learned to listen to him. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded. So that means everyone is important, she asked. Yes, Armin replied softly, kissing her forehead. Everyone is important. Those words became his new philosophy. Whenever he faced decisions, he reminded himself to ask, who have I not listened to yet? Who else might have an answer? He carried that lesson into every meeting, every project, every conversation. It made him more patient, more open, and, strangely, more confident too. Because he no longer felt alone in the weight of leadership. He understood that he had a team, and within that team, brilliance could come from anyone, at any time. The humility also changed his relationship with the shareholders. At first, they were skeptical of his new approach. Some didn't like the idea of giving equal voice to everyone, fearing it would create chaos. But when results started showing, when clients returned, projects succeeded, and profits grew, they could not argue with success. Armin explained to them that his new system was not about weakening leadership, but about strengthening it through trust and openness. Slowly, even the toughest critics began to respect him more, seeing that he had turned a near collapse into a story of resilience. And through it all, Armin never forgot Imran. He often visited him during the evenings, sitting with him in the quiet halls after most people had left. They would talk, not just about work, but about life, about struggles, about how wisdom often comes from hardship. Imran became more than just a janitor to Armin, he became a friend, a reminder of the values that truly mattered: humility, respect, and the courage to listen. The lesson of those days became part of Armin's identity, shaping not only the company but also the man he was becoming. He no longer measured his success by how much money he earned or how many clients he kept. Instead, he measured it by how much he grew as a person, how well he could lead without arrogance, and how much he could inspire his daughter to see value in every human being. He knew there would be more challenges ahead. Business was unpredictable, and life was never easy. But now he had a new strength, one that came not from pride, but from humility. And in that humility, he found peace. The weeks that followed brought a new energy into Armin's life and into the company. What had once been a place filled with silent fear was now buzzing with hope. People walked into the building with straighter backs and brighter faces. There was no more whispering in corners about the company shutting down. Instead, there were conversations about new projects, fresh opportunities, and better ideas. For the first time in a long while, Armin felt like his company was alive again. But what mattered more to him than the numbers or the projects was the culture that was slowly growing. He had seen firsthand how a man everyone overlooked had saved the company. That truth never left his mind. He wanted to make sure that no one in his company ever felt invisible again. So, he made changes, small ones at first, but each change carried meaning. One of the first things he did was call Imran to his office. The janitor arrived shyly, wiping his hands on his uniform, unsure why the CEO himself wanted to see him. Armin stood up, shook his hand firmly, and said, "You are no longer just our janitor. From today, you are our problem-solving coordinator." Imran's eyes widened in disbelief, but Armin smiled and continued, "You see things others don't. You pay attention. That makes you valuable in ways most people can't measure." At first, Imran hesitated. He was a humble man who had spent years quietly working in the background. But Armin reassured him that this new role was not about fancy suits or titles, it was about using his natural gift of observation and common sense. Imran accepted, and soon, he became a bridge between employees and management, helping bring forward small ideas that led to big improvements. The company began to treat him not just as a staff member, but as someone whose voice carried weight. For Armin, it was symbolic. It proved that greatness can be found anywhere, even in the quietest corners of a workplace. With this new approach, Armin began to see his company transform. People who had once kept silent now spoke up in meetings. An assistant suggested a simpler way to handle client reports, and it saved hours of work every week. A receptionist shared feedback from clients that had gone unnoticed, and it helped the sales team win back trust. Even interns felt bold enough to suggest ideas, and many of those ideas turned into real solutions. The office no longer felt divided between bosses and workers, it felt united, like one team. Clients noticed the difference too. They felt the energy when they visited the office, the way employees carried themselves with pride. Slowly, old clients who had lost faith returned, and new clients began to sign deals. The company's reputation shifted from struggling to innovative, not because of expensive consultants, but because of the culture Armin had built. It became known as a place where every voice mattered, where creativity could come from anywhere. But while the company grew stronger, the biggest change was happening inside Armin himself. He was no longer the man who carried the world on his shoulders alone. He had learned to share the weight, to trust others, and to see value in people beyond their titles. This made him not only a better leader, but also a better father. At home, his daughter, Aisha, saw the difference. He was present with her now, not just physically, but emotionally. He laughed more easily, listened more patiently, and even had time to cook dinner with her on weekends. One evening, as they sat on the balcony looking at the stars, she leaned against him and said, "Papa, you're not sad anymore." Armin smiled and hugged her close. "That's because I finally learned something important," he said. "I learned that strength doesn't mean doing everything alone. It means listening, trusting, and remembering that everyone has something to give." Aisha thought about it and nodded seriously, as if storing his words like treasure. For Armin, that moment mattered more than any business victory. It meant he was teaching his daughter not just through success, but through values she could carry into her own life. The story of the janitor solving the unsolvable problem spread quietly among people in the industry. Some found it unbelievable, while others found it inspiring. For Armin, it became part of his personal philosophy. Whenever he was invited to speak at conferences or business gatherings, he shared the story openly. He would stand before rooms filled with CEOs, managers, and professionals, and tell them about the night when 12 consultants had failed, and the janitor had saved everything. People always reacted with surprise, sometimes even laughter, but when he explained the lesson behind it, that leadership is about humility and listening, the room always grew thoughtful. Not everyone agreed with him, of course. Some still believed in traditional hierarchies and expensive experts. But Armin no longer cared about fitting into their expectations. He had lived through the storm and found his truth. He had seen the power of giving people respect, no matter their role. And that truth made him confident in his path forward. As the months passed, the company grew steadier. The financial crisis that once threatened to end everything slowly faded into memory. What remained, however, was the story of transformation. Employees often told new hires about how the janitor had saved the company, almost like a legend passed down. It became part of the company's identity, a reminder to never underestimate anyone. Armin smiled every time he heard it repeated. To him, it wasn't just a story, it was the foundation of everything he wanted his company to stand for. One day, when he was driving Aisha to school, she asked him, "Papa, do you think I can also solve big problems when I grow up?" Armin looked at her through the rear-view mirror and said, "Of course you can. Don't ever think you're too small or too young. Sometimes the biggest solutions come from the smallest voices." She grinned, and in that smile, he saw the future he had been fighting for. Armin's life was far from perfect. He still faced challenges, deadlines, competition, and the endless demands of running a business. But now, he faced them with a calm heart. He no longer saw himself as a lonely man carrying an impossible burden. He saw himself as part of a team, part of a community, and most importantly, as a father who was showing his daughter that resilience, humility, and kindness were the true measures of success. What once seemed like the end of his career had turned into a beginning he never expected. The failure of 12 consultants had opened the door to the wisdom of one janitor. That wisdom had not only saved a company, but also reshaped a leader, rebuilt a father, and reminded a daughter that her papa really was strong, not because he never struggled, but because he never stopped learning, never stopped listening, and never stopped believing in people. And so, as Armin walked through the halls of his company each day, he no longer carried the heavy silence of fear. Instead, he carried the sound of voices, different voices, from every level, from every corner, voices that reminded him that true leadership was never about standing above others, but about standing with them.